Hello, welcome to You and the Law. I'm Mike Monta, your producer and host for tonight's program. And tonight we're talking about a very important aspect of our life here in the United States, and it's about immigration law. And joining me as guests on tonight's show are two experts from the Montgomery County, Dayton area, Southwest Ohio. And they are David Larson from Altick, Corwin, and that's an LPA now, is it?
Yes.
And Ms. Jessica Ramos, who is with ABLE, the Advocates for Basic Legal Equality Incorporated. And she's going to tell you all about what that is in just a little bit here. Before we get into our discussion with our panel, let me remind you that You and the Law is a monthly presentation produced here at the studios of the Dayton Access Television. DATV is on Time Warner Channel 5. It's the public access channel here in Dayton, Ohio. The program is also cablecast north and south, generally on Channel 6, and it's cablecast on tape delay through the auspices of the Miami Valley Cable Council. Executive producer for our program is former domestic relations judge Mike Brigner. Hope Mike's tuning in, and if he's got a question, let's hear it. We are live and in color, and it's a call-in program, and periodically you'll see on the TV screen our number, which is 223-5311, and we also stream live at DATV.org. So if you don't get us on your TV set, you don't have cable, you can watch it streaming live. So without further ado, we're going to turn to our guests who we're happy to have on and share their expertise with you. And we'll start with Dave Larson. Good evening, Dave.
Good evening, Mike. Thanks for having us on the show. And you encouraged me to tell a little bit about myself and how I got interested in immigration law, so I'll start with that. I've been doing it for probably 25 years now, and first got involved practicing law with immigration when Jerry, can't remember his last name now, but anyway, there was an immigration lawyer that was leaving the area, and he needed somebody to take over some cases, so my partner at that time, Pete Serto, and I started doing that. But I've been interested in immigration for a long time because I served in the Peace Corps right after I graduated from undergraduate school, and it gave me a taste for foreign cultures and people, and so it was a natural gravitation to that area of the law, and I really enjoy meeting people from all over the world and doing what I can to help their situation.
Well, that's great, and welcome to being here. And we don't talk to too many folks anymore that were in the Peace Corps. I don't even know if there a Peace Corps still.
There still is.
Do they still send you newsletters or?
You may yes, and emails. You may remember Senator Tony or U.S. Representative Tony Hall.
Sure.
He was recently in town at a gathering at the Peace Museum, which actually right now has an exhibition on Peace Corps service and the people who have come back.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, turning now to Ms. Jessica Ramos, and good evening. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing? Thank
Good.
you for the invitation.
You're welcome, and tell us a little bit about where you've been and what you know about immigration law and what you're going to share with us today.
Yeah. Well, I am a graduate of The Ohio State University.
Go Bucks.
With both a bachelor's and a master's degree in Spanish. And so learning Spanish, I studied abroad, had involvement with the cultures in Latin America, and really piqued my interest after I graduated with what can I do now other than teach now that I'm fluent in Spanish. and worked for an immigration attorney, worked with an interpretation services program for a while, ultimately decided to go to law school. And I always knew that I wanted to practice immigration law. I'm married to an immigrant, so I have a personal experience as well as having numerous friends throughout college and grad school from foreign countries, and always talking to them about their legal situation, and it seemed so much more complex than what people thought. So that's how I landed in the field. And I actually started off my attorney career as an AmeriCorps member, which is the domestic version of the Peace Corps.
Right.
So I served as an AmeriCorps attorney for 2 years, and I've been a staff attorney with ABLE since then.
Well, it's always good to have people on who've done public service, and of course you're still doing it with ABLE. Why is immigration at the focal point of the news these days? We hear about we want people to go back, we don't want them to stay here. Why is this a big problem now?
Me first? Then?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, it's historically it's always been a matter of controversy. I think in the very early days, I think one of the first pieces of immigration legislation was the Chinese Exclusion Act, aimed at keeping Chinese people out of the United States because U.S. workers on the West Coast were concerned that these Chinese laborers were taking their jobs and driving down their wages.
Is that mainly the problem with getting a satisfactory immigration process, is that somebody thinks something that they've got is going to be taken away by immigrants who will work for less?
Yeah, I think all through our history that has been the case. First the Chinese, then Catholics, Irish, Southern Europeans, Italians, Eastern Europeans, and seems to be right now the Latinos are the out group that we're trying to keep at bay.
All right, so originally our country really didn't have regulations, I don't think, for, and of course I'm going back, way back, but there were no regulations. Whoever showed up on the shores could come, right?
Right.
Pretty much.
As a matter of fact, I think Georgia was a penal colony. So England sent everybody they didn't want.
So, just like Australia.
Georgia. Right.
Okay. And how have we progressed then?
Well, I think we're attracting, I guess we're still attracting people of all classes and education levels, income levels. The United States has a unique history in the world in welcoming people who aren't like the ones that are here already. Despite the resistance that we've put up, there's been that other seesaw that we welcome people as well.
They call it the great melting pot, I guess, right?
Yeah, or the salad bowl.
Or the salad bowl, right?
I'd have to somewhat disagree, though. I mean, I think that, yes, our country has had a great history of embracing the ideal of welcoming the stranger. But I think that our current path that we've been on for the last 30 or 40 years when it comes to immigration has really been even more restrictionist than previous decades and previous centuries. I think that maybe because of the competition for resources, but sometimes I think that there's more to it than just people being afraid of someone coming and taking what they have. Sometimes I really believe that it's also a matter of being afraid of the unknown, and people that come from cultures that are less known and less familiar to individuals that are already here. I think that sometimes causes fear and somewhat rejection.
You don't see, I don't think, it's much of a push, say, like to be an immigrant to France or Germany or Egypt or Japan or something like that, you see a lot of death to America, yet it seems like not enough people can get in. What is the process if you wanted to get in legally?
Well, actually, there's a great graphic that we have, an immigration chart that shows just a few ways to get a green card, which is something that allows you to have a permanent residence here, meaning you can live and work indefinitely in the United States. You can still be deported if you commit certain types of crime, but that is one of the main statuses that people seek here.
Let's see if could we put that on our center screen here? Or you could take a look back there, I guess. Is that the one we wanted
That's not the one I was talking about, actually. I was talking about a chart.
Okay.
That's kind of a list.
There it is.
There it is.
There it is. Okay.
So
those are some of the steps.
Oh, there it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can see that that it's a really simple process, as you can see. That's sarcasm. It's extremely complicated, and it's very convoluted, and it's very tiny print. But everywhere you see a tiny circle, that is a clock. That means you are waiting. Sometimes that wait can be months. Sometimes that wait can be years. Sometimes that wait can be decades. And as we may see in a little bit, it can even be centuries at times to get certain statuses.
Okay, so you could be waiting your entire lifetime. This is for a person who lives outside the United States.
Correct.
And attempting to get a
green card.
A green card,
Right.
which is what?
Well, let's go back to the first slide that they had.
All right. See if we can do that.
Which were the categories of immigrants.
Okay.
So these are kind of, it's definitely a lot more complicated than this, but I tried to break it down into general categories of people. So everyone seems to be familiar with a U.S. citizen, right? What is a U.S. citizen? Someone who was either born here or born in one of our territories, or who was born abroad to a U.S. citizen parent and may have met other requirements. Or it can be someone who has become a naturalized citizen, which is someone who had a green card and they met all of the requirements, took their tests, and eventually became a U.S. citizen.
Okay.
U.S. citizens cannot be deported, and once you're a U.S. citizen, that can only, in very rare circumstances, ever be taken away.
Where would you deport a citizen to, right?
Well, the only
Mexico.
example,
Yeah.
the only
Some have been
examples,
deported to Mexico.
Oh.
right?
All
The
right.
only real example that that was popular or well known or heard of in recent times was of a Nazi that lived in a former Nazi guard that lived in Cleveland, who had lied on his naturalization
Demanchuk,
application.
case.
Right.
Okay.
So he was eventually denaturalized and deported. So a lawful permanent resident, that's what people commonly call a green card, which they are green again. They went through a couple decades of not being green.
That means you're legally here from somewhere else. And
Correct.
what's the time scheme on that?
So the time scheme is that you are allowed to live and work indefinitely in the United States. In order to become a naturalized U.S. citizen, you must always have had your green card first. There's like a limited exception if you're in the military, but other than that, everyone that has become a naturalized U.S. citizen had a green card first.
Okay.
So the next categories are a little different. We have kind of humanitarian categories such as refugees, asylees, people with temporary protected status. Those are people who, for whatever reason, they may not be able to return to their home country, either due to persecution that they would fear being killed or tortured, or because there's some sort of natural disaster or government unrest, and they are allowed to remain temporarily in the United States.
Okay.
A non-immigrant visa holder are people that are allowed to come for a limited duration and a limited time. So examples of that would be a student visa, someone who comes here to study, or a visitor visa, someone that comes to work temporarily, and that literally every letter between A and V, as in Victor, every single letter is a different type of non-immigrant visa.
All right.
So I can't even begin to name them all or tell you what they all do.
Okay.
And the last two categories are individuals that may not have what we call a lawful immigration status. Deferred action or withholding of removal. Deferred action is big in the news right now because that was part of President Obama's plan that was announced back in November. And of course, we may be talking about that a little bit later. And then the final category is what we call undocumented, underdocumented, unauthorized, or my favorite new word, undocumentable. So these are people that, for whatever reason, lack a path to a lawful immigration status. And it's not a matter of being lazy, or it's not a matter of not wanting to follow the rules, but it's that literally there is no path for them to get on, or that path is so long, the waiting time is so long that they will never reach it in their lifetime.
Well, I'd like to jump in.
Go ahead, Dave.
With regard to the non-immigrant visa holders, in order to come in and have work authorization, you pretty much have to have a bachelor's degree.
Okay.
There are a limited number of agricultural laborers and seasonal laborers that are allowed in for limited periods of time each year. That's in maybe the 60 to 70,000 per year in each category. But otherwise, if you're an unskilled worker, you can't come in and work in the United States. There's no category for you.
Okay.
Again, there is a limited exception. There are 5,000 unskilled workers a year that can come in as permanent residents, green card holders. And during the early 2000s, about 800,000 people a year were crossing the southern border.
Those are the people that are not in the non-immigrant visa holder category then?
Correct.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
And the reason I brought that up is because I think that's one of the main problems that our immigration system is facing, is that we, in my practice lifetime, 30 years, we have not had any legal way for unskilled workers to come in and fill the jobs that unskilled workers fill, carrying bricks, making beds, picking tomatoes. There just has
all the jobs. Everybody says, well, why don't we have any more of these people, right?
Yeah, I mean, in my practice, one of the populations that we serve are agricultural workers, migrant farm workers, for example, who are people that travel throughout the United States to pick our crops. And I can say that I've never seen someone that was not of Latino origin or of an immigrant origin out in the fields picking cucumbers or tomatoes or peppers. It's long, hard work and long hours and not a lot of pay. And I think that David is right, that is one of the big downfalls of why our immigration systems, the reforms that have happened, the last two major ones in '86 and '96, both failed because they did not take into account the fact that there is a demand for unskilled labor that is not being met by the domestic workforce. And so therefore, if there's that gap, people are going to come to try to fill it because it's better than what they can find in their own home countries.
So when we hear criticism and commentary in the media of why don't these people apply like everybody else, that's the reason. There's no category.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And is there a thought to change that we know of?
Yes, the Senate, what was it, a year or two?
Last year. Yeah, it was last session.
Okay. The Senate proposed an immigration reform bill that would have provided for a regulated system for unskilled workers to come into the United States. And this is really a great idea because it will not only help our economy, I think it will help our security on the southern border, because there's no way for people to come in legally to do these kinds of jobs, so they cross through the desert.
Right.
If there's a way to come in legally, they'll be entering at the borders through the inspection stations. And that means that the people who are crossing through the desert are probably involved in trafficking drugs or arms or human beings, and it'll make it easier for us to enforce and secure our borders.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break. Our clock isn't working as well as it should, and I think we're at a point where we should talk a little bit about the Dayton Bar Association, because they're the sponsors, and give you, the viewing audience, a little time to think about those questions that you might want to call in about at 223-5311. We're talking about immigration law tonight with Mr. David Larson from Altick and Corwin here in the Dayton area. They're actually in Dayton. I know they're right in the middle of Dayton, aren't they?
We're in the Fifth Third building.
Yeah. And Ms. Jessica Ramos, who is an attorney with ABLE, and that's right in the middle of town too, isn't it? So the Bar Association sponsors us. We've been around since 1883, which is longer than most of us, probably even combined, and serves the community with a variety of services. We have a lawyer referral service. If you don't have a lawyer and you have a particular problem, don't know what kind, call Bar Association at 222-6102. The general number is 7902, 222-7902. I don't know if you're going to remember all this or not, but remember the Dayton Bar Association, and you'll find it. They have a notary public service for applications and testing. A lot of times businesses need somebody to have notaries, or if you want to notarize somebody's car title around the neighborhood, I guess. One of the most important programs we have is Wills for Heroes, volunteer members creating wills for emergency first responders, firefighters, police, EMTs, very valuable. And call the Bar Association. I think they have theirs about once a month. Dave, have you ever volunteered on one of those?
Yeah, I regularly do volunteer lawyer project cases. Usually they're bankruptcy, personal bankruptcies.
Yeah, very, very valuable service and very helpful to the community public service, community service projects, which is what Dave was just talking about. Our website is www.daybar.org. And there's also a volunteer lawyers project, which is what you were also talking, VLP.
Right.
The lawyer referral service we talked about earlier. So Bill Wheeler is the director over there. He's been director for, what, 20 years now almost?
A long time. I don't
hasn't
remember
aged
any
a bit,
other
but doing a great job over there. So that's the Dayton Bar Association, and we're happy to have them sponsor us. We're talking about immigration law. Again, 223-5311. If we could, there it is. It's up on the screen now. Right. I know we have an intelligent audience who remembers things very well, but I always have a problem remembering phone numbers. When somebody calls me and leaves me a message, they zip that phone number right across, and I don't.
Yeah, I have to listen to the message 3 or 4
times.
Yes.
So if you are listening, the folks that we have on tonight are as expert as you're going to get about these subjects. Let's talk about the president's initiative right now for, I guess it's for undocumented immigrants, and why he is being opposed. What's the opposition? You don't have to give me a policy statement or anything, but what's the crux of the problem?
Well, I think the major sticking point is what the president named Deferred Action for Parental Accountability.
DAPA, I think they call it. Right.
DAPA. And what that would do is it would give people work authorization for a 3-year period, which means they could get driver's licenses. At least currently they would be able to get driver's licenses. The last program that was similar was called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
DACA.
DACA, yes. DACA. That was aimed at young people who came here when they were under the age of 18 actually under the age of 16. They had to have been here before they turned 16 in order to be eligible for DACA. And that program has been fairly successful. I think about 500,000 applications have been approved and around 24,000 denied, something like that.
Let me break in just a second. Our floor director tells us we have a phone call. So
great.
Let's see if the phones are working, and welcome our caller. Good evening. You're on You and the Law.
What?
Go ahead with your question.
Oh, I have a question about when someone's deported and their children are U.S. citizens, what are the children's options?
All right, that's a good question. I think that follows right up with what Mr. Larson was talking about. So,
Sure. Well, as far as what happens to the children if they're U.S. citizens when a parent is deported, that is partially the parent's decision. They can choose to make arrangements to have the children travel with them back to their home country of the parent. They can make arrangements for the children to stay behind with another family member or parent, or what we oftentimes really discourage and what we hate to see is sometimes they can be left behind in the foster care system, which no one really wants. But that is an instance where you do almost see a deportation of U.S. citizen children because de facto when their parents may be deported, if there's no one else left to care for them in the United States, then these U.S. citizen children may have to return to live abroad with a parent.
I think what we've seen more often is that the father gets deported, and the father is usually the wage earner. So mom and children are left here in the States without that source of income. And that was one of the president's initiatives last November, was to change the priorities for who gets put in removal proceedings, who gets deported. And so, obviously we want to deport people who are involved in criminal activity, serious criminal activity, or terrorist activity. And so, part of the whole controversy is, should the president be allowed to set those priorities? And I think most people say yes, you have to set priorities on who you're going to go after because you've got limited resources and you can only deport so many.
I mean, the most amount of people that we've ever deported in a year is a little under 500,000, 500,000.
Seems like a lot.
It seems like a lot, but when you think that there are 11 million plus undocumented immigrants in the United States, that's going to take you 22 years to deport them all. Meanwhile, that's supposing that you are able to reduce border crossings and other overstays to zero. I think one main opposition that we see to these programs is some confusion about what is immigration law. Immigration law is civil in nature. There are two types of law. We have criminal law. Criminal law is the type of law that we are punishing behavior because we have deemed it to be morally wrong. We also have civil laws. Civil laws are for the order of our society. One of the big problems is that many people presume that immigration law that they're criminals, but many people that are facing removal or deportation have maybe not even committed a crime. If you've come here on a visa and your visa expired but you stayed, you have committed only a civil offense. And I think people that are against immigrants and say, well, they did cross a border, for those that crossed the border illegally without permission, I mean, yes, that is breaking a law and that is a criminal offense. It's a misdemeanor. However, is that something that we deem morally wrong, or is that something that's for the order of society? So one of the things that I think people often get wrapped up in is the criminality of immigrants and confusing immigration violations with crimes when they're not always one and the same.
Right, and immigration reform legislation always takes into account that there was something wrong that happened.
Right. Yeah.
And so you have to pay a fine, You have to go through fingerprint checks, background checks. You have to show that you're paying taxes, that you're employed, that you're being productive. Those kinds of things are always included in the immigration reform legislation, and it's really unfair to label it as an undeserved amnesty.
Right.
People have turned amnesty into a dirty word, when in fact many people have benefited from various forms of amnesty, usually public library fines.
Right. Okay.
Turn in your books.
And I believe that, and I don't know the exact statistic, but I do know that over half of people that are here that are technically undocumented have been here for over 5 years. It's a great number, more than half. So these are people that have been here and have established lives, maybe working, they may have families. But I think that I have 2 other graphics that I think will kind of inform the conversation a bit.
Let's see if we
So
can.
the first one is waiting times for family visas.
Okay, let's see if we can bring that one up.
That's it. Now this is a little
Okay.
dated. This is actually from February of this year instead of, I believe the May version is out. But it looks like a whole bunch of confusing numbers, but I'll kind of explain what it is. So one of the main ways that people can immigrate to the United States to get their green card is through a family relationship.
Okay.
That is something that our country has held dear to throughout many immigration reforms, is that we believe that family members have the right to bring other family members to join them in the United States. So this complicated chart is basically, it has a whole bunch of dates in it, and those are dates of visa processing times. So there's different categories based on the type of family relationship, and there's also different columns there based on certain countries. So we'll just pick an easy example. Mexico, the 4th preference, which is F4, is a sibling of a U.S. citizen. So I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm originally from Mexico. I have become a U.S. citizen, or I was born a U.S. citizen. I have a sibling who is not a U.S. citizen that lives in Mexico, and I want to apply for that person. Right now, they are processing applications from April 22nd of 1997. So the average person would think, okay, 1997, we're in 2015, so it looks like the wait, if I apply now, it looks like the wait will be about 18 years before I get my visa. Seems...
You might lose interest.
It could, but let's look at the reality
Okay.
of the situation. So if the next slide, please.
Okay.
This is actually, this information is almost 5 years old now. Somebody way smarter in math than me sat down and they took how many visas we give out per year and calculated how many people are already in line to see what the actual wait times would be for some of these categories. So if you look down at the very bottom and you see 4th preference, which is a brother or sister of a U.S. citizen, and 2 boxes over is Mexico. So if someone filed in November of 2010 and they decided, okay, I'm filing my visa for my brother or sister, how long before the brother or sister actually gets their visa? It would be 162 years. And visas do not pass down through generations. They die with the individual.
The person you're trying to get.
Well, they die with the person who requests the family member.
Well, let me add a little bit of explanation. The reason that it takes 162 years instead of 18 is that for every calendar year that goes by, that priority date, that place in line, might only move a week.
Okay.
Sometimes the place in line even goes backwards, depending upon how many people actually apply for immigrant visas or green cards who have had petitions filed for them sometime before.
Well, call me crazy, but you look at this chart and you're thinking, what's the point?
Exactly. And that
Yeah,
is
I got
why,
that one right.
well, that is what from many family perspectives,
Right.
you know, they go through this process, and you can see that, you know, Mexico. If you are a family member of somebody from Mexico, and you're waiting for a visa, unless you're a spouse or an unmarried child of a green card holder, every other category is decades, if not centuries long. So the reality of the situation of ever being reunited with their family, even if they may not know this, they're waiting for decades trying to go through this legal system where
Trying
they
to
will
do it right, yeah.
and they're trying to do it right, and they will never ever succeed because they only give out a certain number of visas per year.
Yeah, sometimes restrictionists will say, well, they should get in line.
Right.
Well,
These
if
are the
it's a
lines.
162-year
Right.
line,
Okay. They should be watching us then, shouldn't they, and find out why the fallacy.
There we go,
in
yeah.
these programs. So that would be a partial explanation of somebody who isn't just illegally running across the border, maybe moving up with a family that's already here because they know it's not going to work otherwise. You think?
Correct.
Yep.
Let me add something else that I always like to describe to people. There's a catch-22 in our immigration laws, whereby if you entered with a visa initially, if you entered legally, and you overstay, fall out of status, become undocumented, but you marry a U.S. citizen, you can stay in the United States and apply for a green card in the United States. But if you cross the border illegally to begin with, entered without inspection, then the only way you can get legal again is to, or for the first time, is to go back to your home country, apply for an immigrant visa, and come back in. The problem for people who entered without inspection comes in with another provision of the law that says anybody who's in the United States for over a year without authorization and then departs is barred from reentry for 10 years. So that means that almost everybody who came across the southern border without inspection is stuck here unless they're willing to go back and wait 10 years to get an immigrant visa and come back in and join their family.
Well,
To live with their U.S. citizen spouse and or children.
That's why about 80% of the 11 to 12 million undocumented individuals in the United States are Latino from south of the border.
Our floor director tells us we've got a couple of phone calls, so let's take them in the order that they came. Good evening, you're on You and the Law.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome. What is your question?
I'm a big fan of the show.
Thank you.
I have a question about visas and visa options. And particularly, I have a friend who came to the United States sort of on false pretenses. She was brought thinking that she was going to be doing house care and child care for a family, a diplomatic family, and then basically ended up in a sort of domestic slavery type situation. And she was fortunate enough to break free from that, but now she's in this sort of limbo where she can't go back to her home country, but she also doesn't have a visa or a green card or anything here. So I've heard about something called a U visa or a T visa, and I'm just wondering what she should do, what sort of process she should go through to try to adjust her status so she can be here legally.
Okay, thank you very much. What do we think?
Sure. That's actually something that my organization works a lot with victims of serious crime or victims of human trafficking. So it sounds like potentially she could be eligible for something called a T visa, which is a visa for victims of human trafficking. And trafficking...
Does that fall into trafficking, though, when somebody just comes up to be a housekeeper?
Yeah, so that is one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have about trafficking.
Okay.
I think a lot of people hear trafficking and they instantly think sex trafficking.
Right.
But I think it's actually more common that their labor trafficking is far more common and is even harder to scope out than a lot of the sex trafficking. So those types of indentured servitude or domestic slavery situations are common, and we have seen those with T visas. So basically, she may be eligible for services with my nonprofit organization, Advocates for Basic Legal Equality, or there's a number of other resources out there for victims of trafficking. So I would say she definitely needs to consult with an immigration attorney about her options.
And depending upon what her masters have done to her, she might also be eligible for a U visa, which is available for people who are victims of certain crimes.
Okay.
Usually pretty serious crimes like kidnapping, rape, assault, that kind of thing.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Do you have any follow-up?
No, I think that I will probably try to direct her towards those resources.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, I think do we still have another call, Mr. Floor Director? If we do, we'll take it.
Yes.
Is it a yes? Okay, yeah, well, let's hear it. Welcome to You and the Law, if you're there.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you tonight?
Good. I have a question. In the most recent round of immigration reform, I saw that one of the big contentious issues is amnesty, and I guess I'm wondering what the major criticisms of amnesty are, and if they're really legitimate or if it's more of a political argument used to win elections.
All right.
Well, politics has a lot to do with it. And, as I said before, amnesty has taken on a more negative connotation than it used to have.
You give us a little overview of what the amnesty is.
Well, the last legislation that helped people get documents came during the Reagan administration. And I think people were talking to President Reagan and said, well, what are we going to do about all these undocumented? And he said, well, let's give them documents. So they did. They passed a legalization program,
Okay.
and you had to meet certain requirements at that time too. Do background checks. There had to be payments of fees in order to get your green card. And even though it was a failure at preventing additional undocumented population from increasing, it was very successful in integrating people into the society, into the mainstream of American life. So I don't know what the great problem is with the notion of an amnesty program, because it's never proposed as a flat, here you go, take one. It's always proposed as learn English, pay a fine, show that you're productive, that you're paying taxes. It's always got the same kinds of things that any other wrongdoing would require, that you do something to make up for the wrongdoing that you have perpetrated.
Yeah, I would say that I think that a lot of the negative views towards amnesty, it is a buzzword, and I think I agree with David's point that it's not, it's a tit for tat. It's not something for nothing. But I think a lot of it comes from people's, outrage that someone that has committed a crime allegedly, or maybe even not, but like I said it before, but someone that has committed a crime would then get a pass some sort, that they would be able to leapfrog people that may be waiting in these lines. And I think that that unfortunately a lot of that again goes back towards, well, why is it that we dislike this particular population of individuals? Is it because they're different from our own culture? Is it because they tend to speak different languages? They tend to look different than we do? I think there's a lot of reasons that certain individuals may have that people need to look kind of introspectively and determine why it is that they have such a dislike for a legalization program.
As Jessica said earlier, a lot of it has to do with fear. Just prior to September 11th, 2001, it looked as though there was going to be some immigration reform, significant immigration reform legislation that President Bush and the President of Mexico at that time had tried to get momentum for. But once September 11 happened, we became obsessed, really, with keeping out any threat, and that obsession carried over into our view of immigrants and whether they would be good for the country or not. In the overwhelming number of cases, immigration is good for the United States. It brings us talent. It brings us entrepreneurs. Immigrants have a much greater rate of entrepreneurial success than the native population. They start more businesses, their businesses are more successful.
And then in turn they employ other people.
Which is what President Romney thought was a good idea, right?
Well,
although not in those terms.
I believe he also had a self-deportation policy
Yes,
for
I
a
know.
while. So
You mean presidential candidate, Ron?
I believe, of course, that's what I meant. So. Let me ask the caller if he's still there, if that answers your question.
Yes, it was very informative. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have any follow-up?
No, thank you.
Thank you for calling and watching. Okay. You know, our floor director, not our floor director, but our backstage director has fixed my clock, and I have to thank him for that. Now I know how much time we've got left in the program. One of the things that you just mentioned counteracts one of the great myths about immigration, and that is that immigrants are a big drain on the U.S. economy or treasury.
Yeah, I mean, that's a frequently heard argument about the harm that immigration causes, that they use services, and frankly, a lot of undocumented immigrants do show up in emergency rooms because there's no other source of health care for them.
Right, yeah.
So a lot of the things that people are afraid of, job loss, wage depression, school use, healthcare use, they have some basis in reality in that people need these kinds of things. But there's not a logical connection between the fears and the reality. In the reality, yes, they use services, but don't forget they're also providing services, and they're also contributing taxes in most cases, and they're also contributing population. The United States actually needs people.
I think there's a little bit of overstatement, though, of some of those. While there may be a basis in reality that that immigrants may use some of our healthcare services, but most people or a lot of individuals believe that they are actually using up all of our public benefit resources, which is not true. To the certain extent, undocumented immigrants that don't have a lawful immigration status are not eligible for food stamps. They're not eligible for Medicaid. They're not eligible for cash assistance. Their children who are U.S. citizens may be eligible for those programs. But if you are an undocumented immigrant, then you are not going to receive any one of those. You're not going to receive, quote, welfare benefits from the United States.
One of the things that I think is talked about a lot is undocumented immigrants that don't have Social Security numbers, they don't pay taxes. How do they pay taxes? Withholding or something? Or?
That's a great question.
You can get, because the U.S. government loves to collect taxes.
Yes.
You can get a tax identification number. And so that can be substituted in a lot of cases for a Social Security number.
Okay.
So it's very possible for people to pay income tax withholding, to pay Social Security and Medicaid taxes, and actually never be able to collect anything back from the taxes that they've paid in.
Right. So with an ITIN number, as they call it, an individual taxpayer identification number, it's a situation where one part of the government looks the other way from the other part of the government. The IRS doesn't have any interest in being an immigration enforcement agency. They just want your money. So they will collect withholding from anyone. And then for a lot of immigrants, I actually work under a low-income taxpayer clinic. And so I do this work for a lot of these individuals. I help them, assist them with applying for these numbers and paying their taxes. And regardless of whether they may be paying income tax, they're paying sales tax. They're paying all of the other taxes, gas tax, consumption use tax. Those are all taxes that everyone pays, whether
Real
you're
property
documented,
tax.
whether you're documented or not.
We have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask about the disparity between the federal laws and regulations and what states do, which may counteract these things. And I think down in the Southwest, some of the states, we won't name, well, you could name them if you want, but they have passed legislation which is different and counteractive and maybe counterproductive to what the federal government is doing. There's a question in here somewhere, and I'm thinking, what is the rationale for doing that, and what can be done or should be done about it? If you say nothing, I'll accept that.
Oh no, I'd never say that.
Well,
I mean, Sheriff Joe down in Phoenix is the big. He goes and rounds up everybody he sees. He asks them for their papers, and then if they don't have them, he puts them in Tent City and tries to ship them out.
Yeah, the toughest sheriff in the country.
Yes.
Well, again, a lot of it is rooted in fear of these Latino, Mexican heritage people coming into our state, taking our jobs, using our services, committing crime. And so the state legislators take those fears to heart, and they pass restrictive legislation aimed at keeping these criminal service user job takers out.
Is it helpful for the immigration problem, or is it just to get elected because of the fear you're talking about?
No, I think people genuinely have these fears, and naturally legislators are going to pay attention to the people. But the question that needs to be asked is there really any basis for these fears? And in most cases, that's not true. That immigrants are not disproportionately using services. And even if they were, let's just take education for an example. What do you want to do with young people, particularly when they reach their teenage years, 13 through 18? Do you want them to be in school or not?
Right.
Well, I think since the title of the show is You and the Law, I will spout some legal jargon.
Yeah.
I think that one thing that many of these individuals fail to appreciate is that immigration is federal in nature. It does not. It is not beneficial for every state to have its own immigration scheme. That would create such a hodgepodge of laws that you would need passports to go between states. And the whole point of the United States is that we are a union. And that is why it is written in the Constitution that immigration is federal in nature, and therefore it's within the purview of the federal government. So the real harm in all of these states making their own law is that it then creates a very unbalanced system. And most of the time, in the case of Arizona, when they passed Senate Bill 1070 a number of years ago, that was mostly stricken down by the United States Supreme Court because it was preempted by federal legislation, meaning the federal legislation ruled over a state legislation when it comes to immigration matters.
Our Congress.
I guess my question should have been before, can they do that? And you just answered that.
No.
Our Congress needs to take immigration reform seriously, pass a bill that fixes a lot of these problems, and I think then we won't see a lot of state legislation.
Regardless of your feelings on immigration, I would say that is really the main point, that if you you really need to speak out to your legislators in Congress.
We're running out of show. It's been a great hour. To you viewers out here, this has been a production of You and the Law. We've been talking about immigration with experts Dave Larson and Jessica Ramos, experts in the field. I'd like to thank all the volunteers behind the scenes who have made this program possible, including our great tech staff who put together some of our PowerPoint presentation. Good night to Lily and Katie. I've been your producer and host. I'm Mike Monta. Thank you for watching You and the Law. We'll see you again next time. Good night.